My name is Jordan Martinez, and 3 months ago, I stood in the middle of my father's retirement party at the Riverside Country Club, holding a single document that would change everything. The ballroom was packed with 40 years' worth of his coworkers from the manufacturing plant, all raising glasses of cheap champagne to toast the man they called a legend on the factory floor. My father, Frank Martinez, stood at the podium in his best suit, the one he wore to weddings and funerals, his voice booming across the room as he delivered what everyone thought would be his final speech as a supervisor. But when he started talking about his disappointment in his eldest child, when he began mocking my career in front of 200 people, calling my work, playing pretend with numbers on a computer, something inside me shifted. I watched him gesture dismissively in my direction, heard the scattered laughter from his drinking buddies, saw my mother's face flush with embarrassment as she tried to sink into her chair. And I realized that the piece of paper folded in my jacket pocket wasn't just a business document anymore. It was the end of everything I thought I knew about my family. When I finally stepped forward, when I approached that microphone and unfolded the contract that proved I owned the very pension fund that would determine whether my father lived comfortably or struggled through his golden years, the silence that followed was deafening. No one laughed anymore. No one moved. And my father's face went white as snow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Riverside, Ohio, I was always the kid who asked too many questions. While my younger brother Kevin played football and talked about following Dad into the plant after graduation, I spent my afternoons in the library reading financial magazines and trying to understand how money actually worked. My parents thought it was a phase. Dad would ruffle my hair and say I'd grow out of all that fancy nonsense once I got older and learned what real work looked like. Real work, according to Frank Martinez, meant showing up at 6 in the morning, getting your hands dirty, and building something tangible that people could touch. For 40 years, he'd supervised the production line at Riverside Manufacturing, watching thousands of auto parts roll through the assembly process, managing teams of workers who respected him for his fairness and his willingness to get in the trenches when deadlines got tight. He was proud of his calloused hands, proud of the pension he'd earned, proud of the fact that he'd never needed more than a high school diploma to provide for his family. I understood that pride, even admired it. But I also understood something he never quite grasped about the changing world around us. While he was building car parts, I was studying how pension funds worked, how they were invested, how they could grow or shrink based on decisions made in boardrooms hundreds of miles away from factory floors. By the time I graduated from Ohio State with a degree in finance, I'd already started trading stocks with money I'd saved from part-time jobs, turning small investments into larger ones through careful research and calculated risks. My father watched my early success with a mixture of bewilderment and suspicion. When I landed my first job at a financial services firm in Columbus, he'd introduced me to his friends as his son, who works with computers in the big city. When I started my own investment company, Apex Digital Assets, with my business partner David Chen, Dad would shake his head and mutter about kids these days thinking they could get rich without breaking a sweat. The truth was, I was breaking plenty of sweats, just not the kind he recognized. 12-hour days analyzing market trends, building relationships with institutional clients, learning the intricate mathematics of risk assessment and portfolio management. By my 30th birthday, Apex had grown from a two-person startup to a firm managing over $800 million in assets. We specialized in modernizing pension funds for mid-sized companies, taking traditional retirement accounts and diversifying them into digital portfolios that could weather economic storms and provide better returns for retirees. Kevin understood even less than Dad did. He'd gotten married to Ashley, landed a comfortable sales job at a car dealership, and settled into the same suburban neighborhood where we'd grown up. During family dinners, he'd make jokes about my mysterious career, asking if I was some kind of stockbroker like in the movies, always with a tone that suggested he thought I was either lying about my success or involved in something vaguely criminal. My mother, Linda, tried to bridge the gap between us, but I could see the confusion in her eyes too. She was proud when I bought my downtown Columbus condo, proud when business magazines started mentioning Apex Digital Assets as an emerging player in pension fund management. But she didn't really understand what any of it meant, and more importantly, she couldn't translate it into terms that would make sense to my father. The irony was that everything I'd built, every client I'd signed, every successful investment strategy I'd developed, had been motivated by wanting to prove something to the man who'd raised me. I wanted him to see that my kind of work mattered too, that understanding financial markets and managing other people's retirement security was just as valuable as anything that happened on a factory floor. I wanted him to be proud of me the way he was proud of Kevin's straightforward life, proud of the pension and benefits he'd earned through decades of honest labor. What I never expected was that his pension fund would eventually become mine to manage. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in late September, exactly 6 weeks before Dad's retirement party. I was sitting in my corner office on the 23rd floor of the Huntington Center in Columbus, reviewing quarterly reports for our pension fund clients, when Patricia Williams knocked on my door. Patricia had been my mentor since my early days in finance, a woman who'd spent 30 years navigating the complexities of institutional investing before joining Apex as our senior advisor. She rarely looked rattled, but that morning her usually composed expression carried an edge I'd never seen before. She closed the door behind her and set a thick manila folder on my desk. The tab read, "Riverside Manufacturing Employees Pension Trust, Urgent Review Required." My coffee grew cold as I stared at the familiar name, a slow recognition creeping up my spine like ice water. Patricia's voice was careful, measured. She explained that our compliance department had flagged some irregularities in the Riverside account during routine quarterly auditing. The pension fund had been transferred to Apex Digital Assets 18 months earlier, part of a modernization initiative that many traditional manufacturing companies were implementing to boost returns for their retirees. Standard procedure, nothing unusual there. But the flagged items were anything but standard. I opened the folder and began reading through the documentation, my hands steady despite the growing knot in my stomach. Transfer authorizations, trustee agreements, beneficiary modifications. Everything appeared legitimate on the surface, properly signed and notarized, complete with corporate seals and legal endorsements. But as I dug deeper into the details, patterns emerged that made my chest tighten. The original pension fund had been worth approximately $14 million when it transferred to our management. Respectable but not enormous, representing the accumulated retirement savings of roughly 250 current and former employees. The fund had been conservatively invested for decades, generating modest but reliable returns that would provide basic retirement security for workers who'd spent their careers on factory floors. But someone had been making modifications to. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Individual account allocations over the past year. Subtle changes that wouldn't trigger automatic compliance alerts but would significantly impact specific beneficiaries. Account values were being shifted between high-risk and low-risk investment pools, sometimes without proper documentation of account holder consent. Withdrawal schedules were being altered. Most troubling, several accounts showed signs of what appeared to be systematic value reduction through administrative fee manipulation. Patricia pointed to a spreadsheet showing account performance over the previous 12 months. Most employee accounts had grown at expected rates, tracking with our standard moderate risk investment strategy. But approximately 30 accounts were showing concerning patterns. Excessive administrative charges, transfers into volatile investment vehicles without clear authorization, and in some cases, outright unexplained value reductions. My father's account was one of them. I stared at his name on the spreadsheet, watching the numbers blur slightly as my eyes lost focus. Frank Martinez, employee ID 1127, 40 years of service, projected retirement date October 15th. His account, which should have been worth approximately $130,000 based on his contribution history and our standard return rates, was showing a current value of just over $90,000. $40,000 of his retirement savings had simply evaporated over the course of 18 months. The room felt smaller suddenly, the familiar hum of downtown traffic 23 floors below fading into background noise. I asked Patricia to give me some time alone with the files, and she nodded, understanding without explanation that this was personal. After she left, I sat in the silence of my office, surrounded by the documents that proved my father's financial security was being systematically undermined, possibly by people he trusted. I spent the rest of the day cross-referencing account data with employee records. building a timeline of when the irregularities had begun and who might have authorized them. The pattern that emerged was both sophisticated and deeply disturbing. Someone with access to the pension fund's administrative systems had been carefully selecting accounts belonging to employees nearing retirement, gradually shifting their investments into high-fee funds and volatile instruments that would reduce their overall value while generating additional revenue for intermediary financial services. It wasn't random theft. It was calculated exploitation of people who were least likely to notice gradual changes in their account statements. Workers who'd trusted their union representatives and company management to protect their retirement security while they focused on their jobs. The modifications were being processed through a third-party benefits administration company called Midwest Retirement Services, a firm I'd never heard of before, despite my extensive knowledge of the pension management industry. Their corporate address was listed as a post office box in a suburb outside Cleveland, and their business registration showed they'd been incorporated just 2 years earlier. I called our legal department and requested a comprehensive audit of all communications related to the Riverside manufacturing account. By evening, I had email chains, phone records, and contract modifications that painted a disturbing picture. Someone had been providing Midwest Retirement Services with detailed information about individual employee accounts, including personal financial information that should have been confidential. The modifications were being approved through forged authorization documents that bore the signatures of union representatives and company executives. But the most shocking discovery came when I traced the ownership structure of Midwest Retirement Services through public business registrations. The company was registered under the name Kevin Martinez, with a business address that matched my brother's home on Maple Street in Riverside. I sat back in my chair as the office building emptied around me, watching the city lights flicker on across the Columbus skyline. Kevin had been stealing from Dad's pension fund, along with the retirement savings of dozens of other factory workers. He was using his access to family information and his relationships within the Riverside community to systematically defraud people who'd worked their entire lives for financial security in their golden years. The scope of the theft was staggering. Over the 18 months since the pension fund had transferred to Apex, approximately $800,000 had been siphoned from retiree accounts through fraudulent administrative fees and unauthorized investment transfers. Kevin wasn't just stealing from our father, he was stealing from Bill Thompson, who'd worked the night shift for 30 years to put his daughters through college. From Mike Rodriguez, who'd saved every overtime dollar to buy a small retirement home in Florida. From Tom Anderson, who'd postponed his own retirement to help care for his disabled wife. I thought about Kevin's recent lifestyle changes, details I'd noticed but never questioned. The new truck he'd bought 6 months earlier, claiming he'd gotten a promotion at the dealership. The family vacation to Disney World that Ashley had posted about on social media. Expensive restaurants and resort hotels that seemed beyond the reach of a car salesman's salary. The down payment they'd somehow managed to scrape together for a larger house in a better neighborhood. My brother was funding his improved lifestyle by stealing from retirees, including our own father, and he was using my company to do it. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial crime. Kevin knew Dad's retirement was approaching. He knew how much pride our father took in his pension, how often he'd talked about the security it would provide during his final years. He knew that Mom worried about medical expenses and whether their savings would be enough to maintain their modest lifestyle after Dad stopped working. And Kevin was stealing from them anyway. I locked the files in my office safe and drove home through the dark Ohio countryside, my mind racing through the implications of what I'd discovered. I could stop the theft immediately, reverse the unauthorized transactions, and restore the stolen funds to their rightful accounts. Our legal department could pursue criminal charges against Kevin and whatever accomplices he was working with. The victims would be made whole, and justice would be served. But I also knew that exposing Kevin's crimes would destroy my family. Dad's retirement party was 6 weeks away, a celebration that represented the culmination of 4 decades of honest work. Mom had been planning the event for months, coordinating with his coworkers, arranging catering, designing photo displays that chronicled his career from young assembly line worker to respected supervisor. Learning that his youngest son had been stealing his retirement savings would devastate my father in ways that went far beyond financial loss. As I pulled into my condo's parking garage, I realized I was facing a choice that would define not just my relationship with my family, but my understanding of what justice actually meant. I could protect the people I loved by handling this quietly, or I could expose the truth and watch everything we'd built together crumble under the weight of Kevin's betrayal. I had 6 weeks to decide which kind of person I really was. The next morning brought an October chill that matched the cold knot in my stomach. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and running through scenarios that all ended in family destruction. But when I arrived at the office, David Chen was waiting in my chair, his usually relaxed demeanor replaced by the sharp focus he reserved for crisis management. David had been my business partner since we'd started Apex, and over the years we'd developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's thoughts. He took one look at my face and knew that whatever I'd discovered in the Riverside files was about to test everything we'd built together. I closed the office door and walked him through the evidence, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to the kind of cold anger that comes when someone threatens your professional integrity. David had grown up in a family of immigrants who'd built their success through meticulous attention to reputation and trustworthiness. The idea that someone was using our firm to defraud retirees violated everything he believed about our responsibility to our clients. His first instinct was to contact law enforcement immediately. We had a fiduciary duty to protect our clients' assets, and every day we delayed action was another day that Kevin could potentially drain more money from vulnerable retirees. David pulled up our company's compliance protocols and began outlining the steps we needed to take to report the fraud and distance ourselves from any potential liability. But I asked him to wait. "Just 48 hours, I said. "Give me 2 days to find a way to resolve this that wouldn't destroy innocent people along with the guilty ones." David's silence stretched long enough that I could hear the elevator dings from the hallway outside. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful and measured. He reminded me that our company managed nearly $1 billion in assets for institutional clients who trusted us to act with absolute integrity. If word got out that we'd delayed reporting fraud because of personal relationships, it could destroy everything we'd worked to build. Our other clients would question our judgment, our credibility, our ability to put their interests above our own. I understood his concerns, shared them even. But I also knew that the evidence against Kevin was so clear and comprehensive that a 48-hour delay wouldn't compromise our ability to make things right. The stolen funds could be restored immediately once we took action. The victims would be made whole. Kevin's criminal liability wouldn't diminish because we took time to consider our approach carefully. What I couldn't restore was my father's faith in his family once he learned that his youngest son had been stealing his retirement savings. David agreed to the delay, but only on the condition that I use the time productively. If I was going to handle this privately, I needed to build an airtight case that would prevent Kevin from continuing his theft and ensure that every stolen dollar was returned to its rightful owner. We spent the morning developing a comprehensive forensic analysis of the Riverside account, documenting every unauthorized transaction and identifying the specific mechanisms Kevin had used to access and manipulate individual pension balances. The deeper we dug, the more sophisticated the scheme appeared. Kevin hadn't simply stolen money randomly. He'd carefully studied the pension fund's participant list and targeted accounts belonging to workers who were least likely to scrutinize their quarterly statements closely. Older employees nearing retirement who trusted their union representatives to monitor their accounts. Long-term workers who'd grown accustomed to steady, predictable investment returns and wouldn't immediately notice gradual reductions in account value. Most disturbing was the evidence that Kevin had inside help from someone within the Riverside Manufacturing Human Resources Department. The account modifications required access to personal information that should have been confidential: social security numbers, employment histories, beneficiary designations. Someone with administrative access to the company's personnel systems was feeding Kevin the data he needed to forge authorization documents and process fraudulent transactions. By afternoon, we'd identified Kevin's likely accomplice, Jordan Martinez, my sister-in-law, who worked in the marketing department but had recently been granted temporary access to human resources databases for a company newsletter project featuring retiring employees. The timeline of her access permissions matched perfectly with the escalation of unauthorized account modifications. The betrayal was family-wide. Kevin and Ashley had conspired to steal from my father and his coworkers, using their positions within the Riverside community to exploit the trust of people who'd known them for years. They'd attended church picnics with these families, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, shared holidays and weekend barbecues, all while systematically draining their retirement savings. I left the office early and drove to Riverside, taking the familiar route through small towns and farmland that connected Columbus to my childhood home. The October landscape was dressed in brilliant reds and golds, the kind of autumn scenery that made Ohio beautiful despite its reputation for industrial grimness. But the beauty felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what was happening beneath the surface of my family's seemingly normal life. I parked across the street from Kevin's house and watched Ashley load groceries from their new truck, her movements cheerful and unhurried. She looked like any other young suburban mother preparing dinner for her family, not someone who'd helped steal $800,000 from retirees. The ordinariness of the scene made it somehow more disturbing than if she'd been wearing all black and cackling like a cartoon villain. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom, asking if I'd be coming to Sunday dinner that weekend. Dad wanted to talk about the retirement party, she said, and Kevin had volunteered to help with the slideshow presentation. The irony was suffocating. Kevin was planning to stand at Dad's retirement celebration and deliver a tribute to 40 years of honest work, while secretly profiting from the theft of Dad's pension savings. I drove to the plant where Dad worked, timing my arrival to coincide with the end of his shift. The Riverside manufacturing complex sprawled across several acres of flat Ohio farmland, a collection of low industrial buildings surrounded by employee parking lots and loading docks. I'd visited countless times over the years, but always as Frank Martinez's son, the college boy who'd chosen a different path than the practical working-class values the place represented. Dad emerged from the main building with his usual group of supervisors, men who'd shared 40 years of early mornings and industrial challenges. They moved with the unhurried confidence of workers who knew their jobs so well they could perform them while thinking about weekend plans or grandchildren's school plays. Bill Thompson waved when he saw me, calling out that it was good to see me back in town. Mike Rodriguez asked if I was coming to Dad's party, joking that he hoped I wouldn't wear one of those fancy city suits. The casual friendliness of these men, their genuine affection for my father, and their assumption that I shared their basic decency, made Kevin's crimes feel even more heinous. These weren't anonymous victims whose faces would never haunt his conscience. These were neighbors, friends, people who'd watched Kevin grow up and trusted him because he was Frank Martinez's son. Dad spotted me and walked over, his face showing the mixture of pleasure and puzzlement that always appeared when I showed up unexpectedly. He asked if everything was okay, whether there was something wrong with Mom, whether I'd lost my job or gotten into some kind of trouble. In his world, unexpected visits usually meant crisis, emergency, problems that required immediate family consultation. I told him I had been in the area for business and decided to stop by. We talked about the retirement party, about his plans for the months after he stopped working, about whether he was nervous about the transition from full-time supervisor to full-time retiree. His excitement was infectious, the enthusiasm of a man who'd earned his rest and was looking forward to sleeping past 5 a.m. for the first time in 4 decades. He mentioned that Kevin had been helping with party preparations, working with Mom to create a photo timeline of his career and coordinate with former coworkers who wanted to attend. Dad was proud of Kevin's initiative, grateful that his youngest son was taking such an active interest in celebrating his achievement. Standing there in the employee parking lot, watching my father's genuine happiness about his approaching retirement and Kevin's involvement in honoring it, I felt the weight of my knowledge like a physical pressure in my chest. In 3 weeks, Dad would stand at a podium surrounded by friends and family, believing that his pension would provide security for the rest of his life, unaware that his son had already stolen a significant portion of that security. I drove home that evening with the decision crystallizing in my mind. I couldn't protect Dad from the truth indefinitely. but I could control how and when he learned it. I could ensure that Kevin's theft was exposed in a way that would maximize justice for the victims, while giving my father some measure of dignity in the process. The retirement party would be the perfect venue. Kevin would be there, surrounded by the people he'd victimized, expecting to bask in reflected glory as the son of the honored retiree. I would have documentation proving his crimes, the authority to reverse his theft, and a room full of witnesses to ensure that justice was both served and seen to be served. Kevin wanted to play the role of devoted son at Dad's retirement celebration. I would give him that opportunity, right up until the moment I revealed exactly what kind of son he really was. The investigation took on a life of its own over the following days. What had started as a routine compliance review had morphed into something resembling a federal case, with David and I working 12-hour shifts to untangle the web of financial manipulation that Kevin and Ashley had constructed. Our conference room looked like something from a crime drama, with whiteboards covered in transaction timelines, printed email chains organized by date, and financial statements spread across every available surface. Patricia Williams had brought in 2 additional forensic accountants from our network, specialists who dealt with pension fraud cases for insurance companies and federal regulators. They worked with the methodical precision of surgeons, dissecting each suspicious transaction to understand not just what had been stolen, but how the theft had been disguised to avoid detection by automated compliance systems. The scope of the scheme was staggering. Kevin hadn't limited himself to the obvious targets like retirees and workers nearing retirement. He'd also been systematically skimming smaller amounts from younger employees' accounts, amounts so modest that they'd never show up as significant changes in quarterly statements. $5 here, $10 there, spread across dozens of accounts, and processed through administrative fee adjustments that looked completely legitimate on paper. But the real sophistication lay in how he'd timed the thefts to coincide with market fluctuations. When the stock market had a particularly good quarter, Kevin would increase his skimming, knowing that account holders would attribute any smaller than expected gains to natural market volatility. When markets declined, he'd reduce his theft to avoid triggering the kind of dramatic losses that might prompt individual employees to call the pension fund administrator with questions. Ashley's role extended far beyond simply providing access to employee records. She'd been creating false documentation to support Kevin's modifications, generating fake letters of authorization that appeared to come from employees requesting changes to their investment allocations. Her marketing background had given her the graphic design skills to create convincing letterhead and the writing ability to mimic the communication style of workers who might not feel comfortable with formal financial language. The forged letters were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. They referenced specific personal circumstances that Ashley had learned through her access to human resources files, upcoming medical procedures that might require unexpected expenses, children starting college, home repairs necessitated by aging infrastructure. The letters requested investment changes that sounded reasonable to anyone not familiar with the specific financial implications, but which actually shifted money from secure retirement accounts into high-fee funds that generated commissions for Kevin's shell company. Most disturbing was the evidence that they'd been specifically targeting employees who were unlikely to have family members with financial expertise who might review their account statements. Workers whose children had followed them into factory jobs rather than pursuing college degrees. Older employees whose spouses had passed away, leaving them to navigate retirement planning alone. Recent immigrants who might not fully understand the American pension system or feel comfortable questioning official-looking documents. The pattern revealed a level of calculated cruelty that went beyond simple greed. Kevin and Ashley weren't just stealing money. They were exploiting vulnerability, targeting the people least equipped to defend themselves against financial manipulation. By Thursday, we documented over 90 individual instances of theft across a period of 18 months. The total amount stolen exceeded $1.2 million, significantly more than our initial estimates. But the financial impact was only part of the damage. Kevin's modifications had fundamentally altered the retirement prospects for dozens of families, reducing their expected monthly pension payments by amounts that would force them to choose between prescription medications and utility bills. between maintaining their homes and buying groceries. I spent Thursday evening at my condo, surrounded by copies of the evidence we'd compiled, trying to understand how my brother had transformed from the kid who'd once helped me build tree houses into someone capable of such systematic betrayal. I kept thinking about the Kevin I'd grown up with, remembering the way he'd defended me against neighborhood bullies despite being 3 years younger, the pride in his voice when he'd tell his friends that his older brother was going to college on a scholarship. But the evidence was undeniable. Kevin had spent months studying the financial lives of Dad's coworkers, learning their personal struggles and vulnerabilities, then weaponizing that knowledge to steal their retirement security. He'd sat through family dinners where Dad talked about his excitement for retirement, knowing that he was systematically undermining the foundation of that retirement dream. Friday morning brought a development I hadn't anticipated. Ashley called me at the office, her voice carrying the bright, artificial cheerfulness she'd perfected for family gatherings. She mentioned that she'd been working on the retirement party slideshow and wondered if I had any photos from Dad's early career that she could include. The request seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone triggered my investigative instincts. I agreed to meet her for coffee that afternoon at a small cafe in downtown Riverside, curious about what she might really want to discuss. The meeting felt surreal from the moment I walked in and saw her sitting at a corner table, scrolling through her phone with the casual confidence of someone who had no idea that her financial crimes had been completely exposed. Ashley launched into an animated discussion about the party preparations, showing me mock-ups of the slideshow presentation and discussing the timeline for the evening's events. She talked about how proud Kevin was to be organizing the tribute to Dad, how excited they both were to celebrate his achievements, how much it meant to them to be able to give back to the man who'd always been so supportive of their marriage. The performance was flawless, delivered with such apparent sincerity that I almost questioned my own evidence. But then Ashley shifted the conversation to my work, asking detailed questions about Apex digital assets that went far beyond casual family interest. She wanted to know about our client confidentiality policies, about how we handled compliance issues, about whether pension fund account holders ever received detailed transaction reports that might reveal specific administrative activities. The questions were too specific, too focused on the exact mechanisms Kevin had been using to steal from the accounts. Ashley wasn't just making conversation, she was conducting reconnaissance, trying to determine whether their theft had been detected and what kind of exposure they might face if someone started investigating irregularities in the Riverside pension fund. I answered her questions with deliberate vagueness, providing just enough information to keep the conversation going while avoiding anything that might tip her off to our investigation. But I could see the calculation behind her smile, the careful way she processed my responses, the subtle shift in her body language when I mentioned that pension fund administrators took compliance very seriously. When we parted ways, Ashley hugged me with what appeared to be genuine warmth, thanking me for taking time to help with the party preparations and expressing how much she looked forward to celebrating Dad's retirement as a family. But I noticed that she lingered in the parking lot after I left, making a phone call that lasted several minutes and involved animated gestures that suggested urgency or concern. That evening, Kevin called me directly for the first time in months. His tone was casual, brotherly, but I could hear the underlying tension that suggested Ashley had briefed him on our conversation. He wanted to know if I'd be bringing a date to the retirement party, whether I needed help with hotel arrangements if I decided to stay overnight in Riverside, whether there was anything special I wanted included in the tribute portion of the evening. But then he pivoted to questions about my business, expressing interest he'd never shown before in the specifics of what I actually did for a living. He wondered about the types of clients Apex worked with, about how we'd built our reputation so quickly, about whether managing pension funds was as complicated as people made it seem. The questions felt like probing, an attempt to gauge how much I might know about pension fund administration and whether I'd be likely to notice irregularities if I encountered them. I realized that Kevin and Ashley had become suspicious of my unexpected interest in the retirement party timeline and my presence in Riverside during the week. They were trying to determine whether their theft had been discovered and whether I posed a threat to their continued ability to drain money from the pension accounts. The phone call ended with Kevin expressing how proud he was to have a successful brother, how much he looked forward to introducing me to Dad's coworkers who didn't really understand what I did but were impressed by my obvious prosperity. The comments felt like veiled threats, suggestions that my reputation and success were somehow dependent on maintaining family harmony, and avoiding conflicts that might embarrass Dad during his retirement celebration. After hanging up, I sat in the darkness of my living room, staring out at the Columbus skyline and thinking about the psychological warfare that was beginning to unfold. Kevin and Ashley knew they were vulnerable, but they didn't know how much evidence I possessed or what I planned to do with it. They were trying to manipulate me into silence through a combination of family loyalty appeals and subtle intimidation, counting on my desire to protect Dad from embarrassment to prevent me from exposing their crimes. But they'd made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that my success had made me soft, that my life in the corporate world had distanced me from the working-class values that defined Dad's generation. They thought I'd be more concerned with maintaining my professional reputation than with seeking justice for their victims. They had no idea that their theft had awakened something in me that went far beyond family dynamics or personal considerations. Every dollar they'd stolen represented months of overtime work, years of careful saving, decades of trust in a system that was supposed to protect workers who'd given their lives to building something larger than themselves. Kevin and Ashley had declared war on everything Dad's generation had worked to achieve. They just didn't realize that their enemy was now fully aware of the battle. The Riverside Country Club had been transformed into a shrine to blue-collar achievement. Red, white, and blue streamers hung from the ceiling, interspersed with blown-up photographs chronicling Dad's 4 decades at the manufacturing plant. Tables draped in crisp white linens surrounded a makeshift stage, where a podium waited beneath a banner reading, "Congratulations, Frank Martinez, 40 years of excellence." The smell of prime rib and roasted vegetables drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the sound of laughter and conversation as nearly 200 guests filled the ballroom. I stood near the bar, nursing a whiskey and watching Kevin work the room like a political candidate. He'd positioned himself as the evening's unofficial host, greeting Dad's coworkers with backslaps and handshakes, introducing Ashley to wives and retired employees who remembered her from company picnics. They moved through the crowd with practiced charm, Kevin telling stories about Dad's legendary work ethic, while Ashley collected compliments on the slideshow presentation she'd prepared. The irony was suffocating. Kevin was basking in reflected glory as the devoted son of the honored retiree, accepting praise for his thoughtfulness in organizing such a beautiful tribute, while the evidence of his systematic theft sat in a folder locked in my car trunk. Every person who thanked him for putting together such a wonderful celebration was thanking him for stealing their retirement savings. Mom bustled between tables, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a successful hostess. She'd spent weeks coordinating with the catering staff, designing centerpieces that incorporated tools and machinery from Dad's work life, creating photo displays that traced his journey from young assembly line worker to respected supervisor. This was her moment, too. The culmination of a lifetime spent supporting a husband whose work she'd never fully understood but had always respected. Dad held court at a corner table surrounded by his closest work friends, men who'd shared decades of early morning shifts and industrial challenges. Bill Thompson was telling the story of the time Dad had worked 36 straight hours to meet a critical production deadline, staying awake on black coffee and determination while his crew took shifts sleeping on break room couches. Mike Rodriguez added details about Dad's legendary ability to diagnose machinery problems by sound alone, how younger workers would seek him out when equipment started making unusual noises. The genuine affection in their voices was unmistakable. These men had spent their working lives in Dad's shadow, learning from his expertise, depending on his leadership during crisis situations. They respected him not just as a supervisor but as a mentor, someone who'd help them navigate the complexities of industrial work while maintaining their dignity and self-respect. At 7:30, the formal program began. Kevin took the microphone with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his welcome in any room, thanking everyone for coming to celebrate a man who'd dedicated his life to honest work and family values. He introduced a parade of speakers, union representatives who praised Dad's fairness during contract negotiations, former coworkers who shared memories of his guidance during their early careers, current employees who credited him with teaching them skills that had become the foundation of their own success. Each tribute reinforced the same themes. Dad was a man who'd built his life around responsibility, integrity, and commitment to the people who depended on him. He'd never missed a shift without good reason, never asked his workers to do anything he wouldn't do himself, never compromised his principles for personal advantage. The speakers painted a picture of someone who represented the best of American working-class values, a man whose legacy would inspire future generations of employees to approach their work with similar dedication. When Kevin introduced the slideshow presentation, the room fell silent as images of Dad's career filled a large screen behind the podium. Photos from the 1980s showed a young Frank Martinez learning to operate machinery that looked primitive by current standards. Pictures from the 1990s captured him training new employees, his patient expression unchanged, whether he was teaching someone to read blueprints or demonstrating proper safety procedures. More recent images showed him accepting awards for safety excellence, leadership recognition, and production achievements. Ashley had done masterful work with the presentation, weaving together 4 decades of visual history into a narrative that celebrated not just Dad's individual accomplishments, but his role in the broader story of American manufacturing. The slideshow ended with a photo of Dad at his current workstation, surrounded by machinery he'd helped select and install, wearing the confident expression of someone who'd mastered his craft through years of dedicated practice. The applause that followed was thunderous, sustained, genuine. Dad stood to acknowledge the tribute, his eyes bright with emotion as he surveyed the room full of people who'd shared significant portions of their lives with him. This was his moment, the recognition he'd earned through 40 years of showing up, doing the work, supporting his family, and treating everyone around him with respect and fairness. But then he took the microphone, and everything changed. Dad's voice carried easily across the ballroom as he began thanking people for their attendance and their kind words. He spoke about the satisfaction of building a career around tangible work, about the pride that came from producing something real that served a useful purpose in the world. He talked about the importance of honest labor, about earning what you received through dedication and perseverance, rather than shortcuts or clever manipulation. And then his gaze found me across the room, and his tone shifted. He began talking about the different paths his children had chosen, about how proud he was that Kevin had stayed close to home and built a life around practical values. Kevin, he said, understood the importance of community, family, and honest work. Kevin had married a wonderful woman, established himself in a respectable career, and remained connected to the people and place that had shaped him. But then Dad's voice took on an edge I'd heard before during family arguments, a sharpness that suggested disappointment masked as concern. He talked about children who thought they were too good for the lives their parents had built, who chased after fancy careers that produced nothing real or useful. He mentioned kids who moved to big cities and forgot where they came from, who made money by shuffling numbers around on computers instead of building something with their hands. The room began to shift uncomfortably as Dad's comments became more pointed, more obviously directed at me. People glanced in my direction, unsure whether they were witnessing family dynamics they shouldn't be hearing, or whether this was somehow part of the planned program. Mom's face flushed with embarrassment as she tried to catch Dad's attention, but he was lost in the momentum of his own rhetoric. He talked about the difference between real work and playing pretend, between earning an honest living and getting rich off other people's labor. He mentioned how disappointed he was that some people thought they were better than their families, too important to visit regularly or participate in family traditions. His voice grew louder as he warmed to his theme, feeding off the nervous energy that had begun to permeate the room, and then he said the words that sealed his fate and Kevin's. "My oldest son, Jordan, thinks he's something special because he plays with numbers on a computer all day. He makes money moving other people's money around, pretending that's the same as honest work. He's too good for manufacturing, too smart for the family business, too sophisticated for people like us. Well, let me tell you something about real work, about the kind of work that built this country and puts food on tables and roofs over heads." The silence that followed was deafening. Dad had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, transforming his retirement celebration into a public humiliation of his own son. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes focused on me, waiting to see how I'd respond to being dressed down by my father in front of his friends and coworkers. I set my drink on the nearest table and walked toward the podium with deliberate steps, my heartbeat steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. Kevin's face had gone pale as he realized that something was happening beyond his control. that the evening he'd carefully orchestrated was about to spiral into chaos. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folder containing the pension fund documents. The evidence that would destroy everything Kevin thought he'd built while exposing the truth about the man Dad had just finished praising as a model of integrity and family values. Dad watched me approach with a mixture of confusion and defiance, unsure whether I intended to apologize for my life choices or challenge his authority in front of his guests. The microphone amplified the sound of my breathing as I stood beside him at the podium, looking out at faces that included every person Kevin had stolen from over the past 18 months. My voice was calm, controlled, carrying easily across the silent ballroom. I thanked Dad for his assessment of my career and acknowledged that he was right about some things. Numbers on computers weren't the same as honest physical labor. Moving money around wasn't equivalent to building something tangible and useful. But then I opened the folder and pulled out the document that would change everything. I explained that my company, Apex Digital Assets, managed investment portfolios for institutional clients, including pension funds for employees at manufacturing companies. I mentioned that we took our fiduciary responsibility very seriously, that we considered protecting retirees' financial security to be sacred trust that couldn't be compromised for any reason. And then I held up the contract that proved I owned the management rights to the Riverside Manufacturing Employees Pension Trust, the fund that would determine whether Dad and his coworkers could afford to maintain their lifestyles during retirement. The implications hit the room in waves. First came the realization that I wasn't just some abstract computer worker, but the person responsible for managing their retirement savings. Then came the understanding that I had access to detailed information about their pension accounts, including any irregularities or unauthorized modifications that might have occurred. Dad's face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to recognition, giving way to something approaching fear as he began to understand that his public mockery of my career had been a catastrophic miscalculation. But Kevin understood immediately. His face drained of color as he grasped that I'd been investigating the pension fund, that I knew about the theft, that his presence at this celebration of Dad's integrity was about to become the most bitter irony imaginable. I continued speaking, my voice maintaining the same calm tone as I explained that recent auditing had revealed systematic theft from the pension fund, unauthorized modifications to individual accounts that had resulted in over $1 million being stolen from retirees who'd trusted their union representatives and company management to protect their financial security. The room erupted in confused murmurs as people tried to process what I was saying. These were workers who'd spent their careers trusting institutional authority, who'd assumed that proper signatures and official letterhead meant their interests were being protected. The idea that someone had been systematically stealing their retirement savings was almost incomprehensible. I let the murmurs die down before continuing with the most devastating revelation of all. The theft hadn't been committed by anonymous criminals or distant corporate executives. It had been orchestrated by someone they knew, someone they'd trusted, someone who'd used his access to their personal information and his relationships within the community to exploit their vulnerability. Kevin tried to interrupt, stepping toward the microphone with panic written across his face, but I held up the documentation that proved his involvement beyond any reasonable doubt. Bank records showing payments to his shell company, email communications between him and Ashley discussing specific employee accounts, forged authorization letters created using information from human resources files that Ashley had accessed. The silence in the room was absolute as I methodically destroyed Kevin's reputation and exposed the scope of his betrayal. I explained how he'd targeted the most vulnerable retirees, how he'd timed his theft to coincide with market fluctuations, how he'd used the trust people placed in Frank Martinez's family to steal their life savings. Dad stood frozen beside me, his retirement celebration transformed into a courtroom where his youngest son was being convicted of crimes that violated everything he'd taught his children about integrity and responsibility. The man he'd just finished praising as a model of family values had been revealed as someone who'd stolen from the very people Dad had spent his career protecting and supporting. Ashley tried to run, pushing through confused guests toward the exit, but Bill Thompson and Mike Rodriguez blocked her path with the instinctive solidarity of workers who'd just learned they'd been victimized by someone they'd welcomed into their community. Kevin remained rooted in place, his face cycling through denial, rage, and finally a kind of defeated acceptance as he realized that his theft had been completely exposed. I announced that all stolen funds would be restored to their rightful accounts immediately, that law enforcement had been notified, and would be arriving shortly to take Kevin and Ashley into custody, and that additional auditing would ensure that no other irregularities had occurred within the pension fund management system. The applause that followed was different from the earlier tribute to Dad's career. This was the sound of people who'd just learned that their financial security had been threatened and then restored, who'd discovered that the son they'd dismissed as playing with computers had actually been protecting their retirement savings from the son they'd trusted as family. Dad never recovered from that moment. He aged visibly as he realized that his public mockery of my career had occurred minutes before I revealed that I controlled his financial future, that his praise of Kevin's character had been delivered immediately before Kevin's exposure as a thief who'd stolen from Dad's own pension account. 3 months later, Kevin received a 5-year federal sentence for pension fraud. Ashley received 3 years for her role in the identity theft and forgery schemes. The Riverside Manufacturing Pension Fund was completely restored, with additional security measures implemented to prevent future unauthorized access. Dad's retirement proceeded quietly, without fanfare, with the knowledge that his younger son was in federal prison, and his older son had become a stranger whose success he'd never understood or appreciated. We spoke occasionally, brief conversations that danced around the wreckage of our family relationships, but the distance between us had become unbridgeable. I used the experience to transform Apex Digital Assets into a firm specializing in pension fund security and fraud prevention, working with federal agencies to develop protocols that would protect retirees from the kind of systematic theft Kevin had perpetrated. The work gave me purpose beyond profit, a mission that honored the values Dad had tried to teach me even as our relationship crumbled under the weight of his disappointment and my necessary choices. The folder I'd carried to that podium contained more than evidence of financial crimes. It contained the proof that sometimes protecting people requires destroying the illusions that comfort them, that justice and family loyalty aren't always compatible, and that real work sometimes means breaking the hearts of people you love in order to save them from the people who'd betray them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.